With that, I wanted to say hello to Alex. How you doing, Alex?
I'm doing great, Craig. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to jump in.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. Why don't you get the slides going? And while you do that, I'll mention to the audience that uh, you'll get in what you get out of this today. We've got a lot of slides to go through and information to go through, but I'm sure you have questions about your specific circumstances with related to shareholders agreements. We want to get to all of them, so
Can you
make
enable my screen share there, Craig?
yeah, I could do that.
That would help. Thank you. Sorry to
Da-da-da-da.
interrupt.
No, no, I appreciate that because the whole point of yeah, I think you have access now.
Yeah.
Hey, Ray from Korea, welcome. So as I mentioned, we as we go through this, put your questions in the chat room in the Q&A room. We try to get to all of them at the end, but if they come up while we're going through stuff, put them in there because we want to make sure we answer all your questions. And with that, over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Craig. So today we're talking about preparing your shareholders agreement for equity crowdfunding, but we're also going to talk about just general things to keep in mind when setting up your first shareholders agreement and potentially negotiating a shareholders agreement during your first round of investment. So before we hop in, I just want to be very clear. I am not a lawyer. I run an equity crowdfunding platform, but I do not have a law degree. The opinions that I'm sharing here are my own from my own personal experience. And while I am making generalized comments, these comments may not fit your specific scenario, and you should always seek independent professional legal advice when preparing your shareholders agreement. Okay. Before we hop in, let's talk for a second about why shareholder agreements matter. I know oftentimes, people will start their business and you're focused on running your business and making it happen, and taking the time to go through kind of dry legal agreements and documents isn't always at the forefront of your mind. But certainly when you go out to seek external investment, it's critical to make sure you have a good shareholders agreement in place. Specifically for equity crowdfunding, why do you need a shareholders agreement? Equity crowdfunding allows you to issue shares directly to a large number of smaller investors. Given that these investors are actually buying shares, they will become shareholders, and ensuring your shareholders agreement, which governs the relationship between your corporation and all of its shareholders, including you, ensuring that's properly prepared is critical. While I'm going to focus in this presentation on optimizing your shareholders agreement for equity crowdfunding, as I mentioned already, we're going to discuss critical areas of the agreement that require close attention regardless of the number of investors you have. So also, before we hop in, I'm going to do a quick refresher on some of the basics of corporate governance. So I'm sure many of you know this already, but I wanted to just put it in here to sort of reiterate where the shareholders agreement fits in when it comes to managing your business. So corporations are controlled by their shareholders through voting, often one vote for one share. Shareholders vote to select directors who are responsible for the strategic direction and management of the company. Directors as a group are called the board of directors and are charged with making key leadership and strategic decisions for the company. So you've got your shareholders, they vote and choose the directors, and the directors actually go and run the business. One of the main responsibilities of directors is the hiring of the CEO, who controls the company on a daily basis. So you've got your shareholders, you've got your board of directors, and then your upper management. The shareholder agreement decides several key factors regarding this entire relationship, including the power split between the shareholders and the directors, and how the shareholders can control the corporation through their votes and the power that the directors have. And it's essentially a rule book that governs what you can and cannot do while running your company. So the shareholders agreement is really important to set up that initial control structure of the business. So another thing to note, preparing a shareholders agreement can be considerable work and requires professional legal advice. Even if you have a free template that you use when it's only yourself and a co-founder, when you go out for your first round of large investment, you're going to need paid legal advice to help structure that agreement. Even when working with an equity crowdfunding platform like Equivesto, where we have a free shareholders agreement template you can use, you'll still expect to spend between $1,000 and $2,000 on legal fees. When receiving investment from angels or VCs, you can actually expect to spend between $30,000 and $50,000. The reason why that number is so high is you're actually going to be paying for your lawyer's legal fees and the legal fees of the investors who are coming in. And the company will not get additional raise funds to cover that. So if you're going out to raise $100,000, you should expect that you'll need to pay your own legal fees when negotiating the shareholders agreement with the new investors, and also the legal fees of the new investors. And that's going to come out of your $100,000 that you're raising. Another point that's important to remember is the rights of each share class, which actually decide the control that they have, whether they're common shares, preferred shares, whether they have voting rights or they have access to potential dividends. Those rights are not included in the shareholders agreement. The rights of shares are actually created in amendments to the articles of incorporation and is done separately, even though general rights that apply to all shareholders are included in the shareholders agreement. So you need to make sure you also think about creating those share classes and the rights associated with those share classes in amendments to the articles of incorporation separately from your creation of your shareholders agreement. Okay, so before we dive into it, I'm going to cover some of the main parts of a shareholders agreement and what you can actually expect to find in there. There are essentially 6 general areas that are included in most shareholders agreements, and they are the shareholder details, which outlines who are the shareholders, how many shares do they each have, and the role of different shareholders if they're officers like a president or a secretary, and how often the shareholders meet. The director details, so who are the directors of the corporation, who can select the directors of the corporation, and how often the directors meet. The control of the corporation, so what decision can the directors make, what decision can a shareholder make through voting, who can sign documents on behalf of the corporation, who can hire and fire employees, where is the business located, what type of business does the corporation do, and who keeps track of the accounting and the finances. Shareholders agreements also govern dealing with shares. So can shareholders give their shares to other people like family members or holding companies? What happens if a shareholder gets divorced? Because specifically, depending on the country, the shares might be split between the 2 divorcees. And so the company actually might want to control a situation where they could have a divorced couple each suddenly having control over the business. And how and when can a shareholder sell their shares? It also governs the sale of the business. So what happens if someone wants to buy the business? What is the process, and how would the business be valuated at the time of the sale? And it governs legal protections. So shareholders agree not to sue the corporation, confidentiality clauses, can shareholders start competing businesses, so non-compete clauses, and potentially protection for minority shareholders who own less than 50% to make sure that they are not taken advantage of by majority shareholders. So those are sort of 6 of the most important and largest areas of a shareholders agreement. So let's start with the first one. And one of the key areas that is important to keep in mind when planning your shareholders agreement: shareholder meetings and decision making. So in this area, some of the key factors are how often do the shareholders meet, how much notice must be given before a meeting, what decisions actually require a shareholders vote at a shareholders meeting, how many shareholders are enough for quorum, which is enough people to begin the meeting and vote. Can all classes of shares vote? Can certain shareholders always choose a board member? And do any shareholders hold the right of veto? So deciding exactly these controls around shareholders is a critical piece of the shareholders agreement. This really helps you outline exactly who's involved with the business, what sort of decisions are being made at the shareholder level, and who can be all making these decisions. If you're a smaller business, you probably want to have a lot of decisions being made by the shareholders. You want to call meetings pretty frequently, and most likely everyone has a vote. When you start getting much larger and you have many more shareholders, like with equity crowdfunding, you probably want to move some of that power away from shareholder meetings. You don't want to have to notify 300 people and give them 5 days notice before your meeting and create a Zoom link so all 500 people can come just to talk about a decision that maybe could have been made at a board of directors level. So that balance of control between shareholders and directors is quite important. Also, you want to think about if anyone has veto rights. Often, founders will want to give themselves veto rights so that they can ensure that they have the final say. And if a decision is being made that they don't like, they can essentially cancel or veto that decision. At the same time, creating veto rights can really unbalance the situation and will often lead to new lead investors also requesting veto rights so they can make sure that they're comfortable with a decision that the founder is making. So you want to make sure you keep in mind who is getting veto rights and what the risks are of giving them those veto rights. So here's an actual excerpt from our free template of a shareholders agreement, and you can see exactly what the kind of legal language looks like governing shareholder meetings and shareholder approvals. So it's talking about how frequently they're meeting, what quorum is, which in this situation is 66 and 2/3% of shares with voting rights, and how people are allowed to attend the meeting. Can they attend virtually? And what happens if you don't have enough people there and everything like that. And then we're also looking at examples of shareholder approval. So in this situation, there's minimal decisions being made purely by shareholder approval. And a lot of the work and approvals required to govern the business have been moved to the board of directors level. So you can see here that it requires 66 and 2/3 to vote in favor of something, and it governs, amending or replacing the articles of incorporation, material change in the business, any closing down of operations, any proposal to sell or dispose of substantially a large portion of the assets of the corporation, any change to the auditor, and any change to the number of directors, and if there are going to be any new shares issued, excluding 5% of the outstanding shares annually, which can be issued potentially for employee grants. So now that we've talked about the critical area of shareholder decision making, another really important thing to keep in mind regarding shareholder agreements is directors. How many directors are there? Who gets to pick them? How often do they meet? What decisions can they make? And do any directors have veto rights? One important thing to keep in mind, because of the governance structure of a corporation, is the balance of power and shifting that from shareholders to board members. If you're the founder of a company and you own 80% of the shares, if everything goes to a shareholder vote and it's one vote for one share, it will always be whatever you say goes because you control obviously 80% of the votes. If you have a board of directors with 3 individuals, of which you are one of them, suddenly now, even though you hold 80% of the shares, you only have 1/3 of the vote, 1/3 of the control at the board level. So when deciding which either the shareholders or the directors is controlling the decisions, you're essentially deciding which individuals will have as much power and control and say when making those decisions, which is why people often include veto rights for certain shareholders. But moving the decisions from the shareholders to the directors makes it much easier when you have many shareholders to respond quickly to issues and govern the business in a rapid standpoint, it also potentially removes some of the control from the largest shareholders and founding members. While that's something that many of the founding members might not appreciate because they want to make sure, it's their business and what they say goes, that can also have a positive impact if the other directors are chosen well, because that can help put sort of safety measures in place to help ensure that the business is making the right decisions. And there are people who can stop the founder in case the founder loses their mind and does something sort of crazy. It gives a little bit of insight and assistance to the founder with that decision making. So we highly encourage boards of between 3 and 7, always with an uneven number of members. And we think it's good to have more than just the founders on the board of a company. So here again are some excerpts of actually what section from our template shareholders agreement would look like regarding board approvals. So as you can see, a lot of the decision-making power has been moved from the shareholders to the board, and they're able to choose the salary, benefits, and bonus for different individuals of the corporation. They're able to hire and fire different employees. They're able to authorize the purchase of assets from third parties. They're able to approve going out to get loans or giving loans, getting a mortgage. They're able to incorporate a subsidiary. They're able to enter into a transaction with another shareholder potentially. They approve and declare any dividends, and they can also take out potentially life insurance policies on directors of the corporation. We also included an excerpt which talk about directors' meetings, how often they are, and what timing needs to be provided before they can take place, and everything like that. So definitely directors' meetings would happen much more frequently than shareholders' meetings. And with equity crowdfunding, it's important to move some of that control over to the board and have the board meeting frequently, working well together as a board and with the CEO to ensure that the business is functioning well and able to respond quickly to any potential issues. So as I mentioned, it's really a split between a sort of traditional control setup and a setup that we would recommend for equity crowdfunding. So traditionally, it's a pretty even split in the decisions between the board and shareholder vote. Shareholders, because there's fewer of them, might meet more frequently, and all shares are invited to vote because generally they'll all have voting rights. With equity crowdfunding, if you're bringing in hundreds or even thousands of new investors, we recommend moving more control to the board, sort of like it would be in almost a public company, with shareholder meetings minimized and a lot more control given to the board. That just can make it a lot easier for you as a founder to actually manage and control your business without having to wait and frequently call meetings that would potentially involve some of your new shareholders. A next core piece of shareholders agreements that will be potentially modified when doing equity crowdfunding are the rules governing the sale of shares. So often when you have a small company, there are very strict rules around selling of shares and requirements that must be met before the shares can actually be sold. So for all private businesses, there are actual legal restrictions around the ability for individuals to resell shares. So right now, there is essentially no legal secondary market for the shares of private corporations. You can't go to like a stock market like the TSX and find someone who wants to buy the shares in your private company. They can actually only be sold specifically when meeting the requirements of the business and also of the government to make sure that only individuals who understand, what's actually going on and the risks are actually able to buy those shares. Often the shareholders agreement also adds controls around how shares are sold to protect the business. Even if you have a situation with a shareholder who's invested in your business that isn't going well, rather than them turning around and selling their shares to whomever they like, it's probably better for you as a business to be involved in that process and potentially even buy back the shares directly from that shareholder. So you're able to keep control of the business with shareholders that you have approved of. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. With equity crowdfunding, potentially lessening the requirements around certain share classes being sold could make it easier in the future when there might be a secondary market for shareholders to have some liquidity and sell their shares. But I would recommend this only for potentially non-voting shares or a share class that you've sort of assigned to equity crowdfunding. Another critical piece of shareholders agreements that needs to be modified and kept in mind when doing equity crowdfunding is the pieces in place to protect minority shareholders. So when you start the business and you're the core founder with 80% of the shares, you're able to essentially do whatever you'd like to do when controlling your business. However, because there are individuals who have also invested who control only 20% of the business, they're essentially investing to support the business, but are at your mercy. They, even in a straight vote, will be totally outvoted by you and won't really have any way to control the decisions that you make. As such, it's important to include certain rights that protect them so that they can't be taken advantage of by the majority shareholders. One example of how a majority shareholder could take advantage would be, a company, the startup has been in business for about 5 years. A large tech player in the space has come forward and announced an interest in buying the company. The majority shareholder could, in this sort of situation, offer only their shares for purchase. So the minority shareholder would get their money out and they would exit, but they would leave the minority shareholders still invested in the business. This would make it cheaper for the tech company to buy the business. They would still have full control, but the minority shareholders would be unable to exit and would be stuck still with their shares without a potential liquidity event. So these rights that I've outlined here, the tag along and the drag along rights, are rights that essentially prevent that type of example from taking place. So the tag along rights essentially allows minority shareholders the right to participate if the majority shareholder is selling a large portion of their shares. So instead of essentially a piece of the company being sold from just the majority shareholder, all shareholders would have the same ratio of their holdings sold if they so chose, which protects them and gives them some additional liquidity. Also, the drag along right essentially does a little bit of the opposite. So if the majority shareholder is trying to sell the entire business and a few minority shareholders are refusing to go along, the drag along right essentially enables the majority shareholder to force everyone to sell all of their shares, and then the whole company can be sold to new owners. So it's important to include both tag along and drag along rights in your shareholders agreement to protect minority shareholders. When working with Equivesto, this is actually a requirement, and you can't raise with us if you don't have tag along and drag along rights inside your shareholders agreement. Here is an example of tag along and drag along rights that is directly excerpted from our shareholders template. It's rather long and there's a lot of legal references, but essentially it's outlining exactly the rights that I just described. Another area of the shareholders agreement that you might want to modify when doing an equity crowdfunding round is the non-compete clause. Essentially, this clause is in place to protect a small business from one of the shareholders, going out and starting, a very, very similar business that would directly compete using the knowledge they've gained from investing in this business. So non-compete clauses make sense when you have a small number of shareholders who all have considerable control. When you have a large number of new shareholders without voting rights who aren't involved in the management of the corporation, having a non-compete clause can be rather challenging and is also essentially unenforceable. So it's a bit easier to simply exempt the micro shareholders with non-voting shares from the non-compete clause. Another piece of a shareholders agreement that you might want to modify when doing an equity crowdfunding round would be shareholder investment clauses. So often to help ensure the liquidity of the business when companies are founded by a limited number of people, there's a clause that can be added that essentially requires, if the business is going to go bankrupt and needs money, requiring the existing shareholders to put up the money to keep the business going. And if one shareholder isn't able to pay their portion, that portion then can become a loan actually made by the shareholders who did pay, and that loan is owed from the shareholder who was unable to pay. So this clause can be very beneficial for a small business that's operated by 3 or 4 people, because if you're the one putting up all the money, your shareholder will benefit from you putting up the money, but you want a mechanism in place that sort of protects and acknowledges that, hey, you put up that funding to keep the business alive, and so this other person owes you. However, this can also be challenging when you're operating a business in a sort of startup style and you're looking to grow rapidly and seek external investment multiple times. In this sort of scenario, there's potential, depending on how the clause is worded, to essentially every time you go out for external investment, to force you and the existing shareholders to essentially suddenly now have debts to the corporation. So if you go out for 1 or 2 different external funding rounds, you may end up having quite a large debt to your business, which can be an unintentional impact from having these clauses in place. So unless the clauses are very specifically worded, and they only come into effect at certain times, it might be easier to simply remove a clause like this from your shareholders agreement. And instead, if one shareholder does need to put money in to keep the business afloat, that money can be structured as a subordinated loan from the shareholder to the corporation, which is to be paid back before any dividends are issued. This ensures that the person who ponied up the money does get repaid, but it avoids creating essentially loans or debts between any of the existing shareholders. Another critical amendment when preparing, Craig's laughing, another critical amendment to put in when considering equity crowdfunding is removing the requirement to issue share certificates. Share certificates are essentially a piece of paper that the corporation would issue and would be stamped by the corporate lawyer saying, this says that this individual has this number of shares. This is not required legally, and while it does give a clear outline and proof that this person does own shares, the corporation is also mandated to keep a ledger of all the shareholders and the shares that they own. And when you're going out and getting hundreds or thousands of new investors, where potentially shares might be moving hands a bit more in the future, you don't want to add the massive legal burden of having to issue share certificates every single time you have a new investor. So removing the requirement to issue share certificates from your shareholders agreement, making it optional or taking it out entirely, is something that we would highly recommend. It's totally fine just to record all of your shareholders, at least in Canada, in your shareholder ledger, which can be done digitally, and it makes everything a lot easier when keeping track of hundreds of new shareholders. So a critical piece that needs to be added to a shareholders agreement when doing equity crowdfunding is a JOINDER agreement. So this is how Equivesto helps manage the inclusion of new shareholders, but it is a simpler way, and it is one that we highly recommend. So normally in a traditional situation for a small business, when you go and get new shareholders, because the shareholders agreement is a universal or unanimous shareholders agreement, all shareholders, both new and existing, are required to re-sign the shareholders agreement when new shareholders join and whenever there's any amendment. That way, everyone knows what's going on. Everyone knows that there's a new shareholder. Everyone's sort of aware. So that makes sense when you're operating a small business with a limited number of shareholders. When you're adding hundreds of shareholders at once, you don't want to be in a situation where suddenly you need to get new signatures from everyone involved with the business. And going forward, when you want to seek further investment after an equity crowdfunding round, you don't want to need to get the sign off from hundreds of tiny investors who signed up just to invest in your business and aren't focused on the corporate governance side of it. So A joinder agreement is essentially an appendix or a schedule that's added at the end of your shareholders agreement. And it essentially allows anyone who fills it out and signs it and is witnessed to join on to the shareholders agreement without requiring a reissuance and a re-signing of the original agreement. So this single document, this single page, essentially allows anyone who signs it and is witnessed by a lawyer and signed by you, the corporation. Those people are able to quickly join on to your shareholders agreement and become shareholders. So all businesses working with Equivesto need to include a joinder agreement in their shareholders agreement so that we can rapidly add these new shareholders to your agreement without, all those complications. So as I was just describing, it's important to, have that in place as an appendix so it doesn't require the re-signing like it would require in a more traditional environment. And this is just much easier when you have many, many more shareholders. Here's an example of a joinder agreement, which is an excerpt from our free template at equivesto.com. So it's very simple. Essentially, the new shareholder puts their information in, dates the agreement, signs it, and it can be witnessed by the company or the company's lawyer. So we've covered a lot of different points relatively quickly, so I decided to summarize exactly what is required versus what is recommended in terms of modifying your shareholders agreement when going and doing an equity crowdfunding round. So if you want to work with Equivesto, these are the requirements. You need to have protection for minority shareholders like tag-along and drag-along rights. You need to have the joinder agreement added at the end of your shareholders agreement. You also need to have permission for the shareholders or the board of directors to issue an unlimited number of shares from the new share class that will be used for equity crowdfunding. And it needs to be not required for the corporation to issue share certificates. In terms of recommended changes, as I described a bit earlier, there's several areas that aren't required, but we highly recommend are put in and modified in the shareholders agreement, which will be sort of ease of use changes for the management of the business. So we recommend that they move all but critical decisions from shareholder vote to board control. We recommend that you minimize the number of shareholders meetings per year to only the required one. We recommend that you have at least 3 board members with no veto rights, but no more than 7. We recommend that you hold at least quarterly board meetings, and we recommend that you remove the non-compete clause from the crowdfunding share class. That essentially summarizes the changes that we require and recommend to a shareholders agreement when equity crowdfunding with Equivesto. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to answering your questions in the chat.
Hey, that was great. I had a little bit of an internet outage.
Okay, we're having a bit of a problem with Craig, but I've got the chat open. So I'm just going to scroll to the beginning of the chat and start answering any of the questions in the chat.
I'm going to be switching back. Can you take the first question, Alex?
Yeah. So the first question, I think, is from Anatoly. And you said, what are the comments about drag-along and tag-along clauses for shareholder agreements? So we did discuss that directly. Hopefully that did answer your question, Anatoly, that drag-along and tag-along rights protect the minority shareholders. Okay. The unlimited share issuance. What are the risks of that? So just to be clear, when talking about the unlimited share issuance, we're talking about giving the shareholders of the business the right to issue as many shares as they would like of a certain share class. We are not saying that they're able to issue unlimited shares whenever they want. We're not saying that they can issue shares without checking with anyone. Ideally, what we want to do is for the equity crowdfunding share class, we want to make sure that it's possible for them to issue enough shares for the current round of equity crowdfunding. And often the shareholders agreement is being amended and signed prior to the full discussion of exactly the equity crowdfunding round. And we don't want to limit necessarily the number of shares that can be issued. But again, issuing shares, the decision to issue shares should be something that is governed at the shareholder level and should require a shareholder vote. So shares can only be issued by the corporation, not by shareholders. So I see your question, Amit, here about how shareholders can be issuing shares. So only the corporation can issue shares. The business, the corporation is a separate legal entity to the individuals who have invested in it, and only the corporation itself can issue shares. The shareholders agreement outlines and decides how the corporation can go and issue more shares and what the limits are on that. So what we recommend is that in the rules in the shareholders agreement, the corporation is allowed to create as many shares of whatever share class the corporation so chooses, but the corporation can only choose to issue shares when it's being given permission. So that can either be done at a board level decision or at a shareholder level decision. I would recommend that the decision to issue new shares is done at the shareholder level decision, so that all shareholders are notified that new shares are going to be created, and they potentially can have a vote or a say when new shares are being created, because that will dilute their percentage control. However, as a caveat, we do recommend that you give permission for the board of directors to issue up to 5% of the total number of outstanding shares without needing to seek shareholder approval. This would allow them to essentially create new shares for employee stock options and, giving bonuses to employees and things like that, but it's limited to the maximum 5%. So sometimes in shareholders agreements, there's actually a line written in that says, the corporation can only issue 10 million shares from Class A. And so what we're recommending is that that limit is not included there, but the decision to issue the shares is still done at a shareholder level, except for a small amount that can be done at a board level. Another question has come in.
Yeah, I'm here now, by the way.
For Anatoly, can you offer non-voting shares during a crowdfunding investment round for investors? Yes, you can. And that is actually a share class that we recommend at Equivesto. So you would issue non-voting common shares. And so this would allow the individuals to invest in your business, to potentially benefit from any dividends or the sale of the business. And they would have those minority rights protecting them, but they would not have voting rights. So they could still potentially come to your shareholders meeting and get your annual update of what's going on, but they would not have the ability to vote on any shareholder decisions. Any decisions being made by the shareholders need to be done at a shareholders meeting. And so they would be able to witness and see those decisions, but they would not actually have a vote or a say in the decisions. So that's sort of our recommendation. Okay, that's the next question.
Do you differentiate with what you'd recommend indicated in the shareholders agreement versus what would be outlined in corporation bylaws?
So it's generally easier to put that's a great question. You want to make sure that you have the core rules and the sort of structure outlined in the shareholders agreement, but you also don't want it to be so detailed that you need to be amending and changing the shareholders agreement all the time. Usually the things that go in corporations bylaws are separate than the sort of decisions that are going in the shareholders agreement. Craig, did you have any comments on that?
No, not at all. I think you got it there. And it's important to really talk to your lawyer. So I had a question though, is when people already come in with shareholders agreements and they have to change them, what are the most common mistakes you've seen that cause the most grief?
Yeah, so that's essentially the key items that I mentioned here. So often people will come in with a shareholders agreement generally well prepared, but it's not prepared for equity crowdfunding. Most lawyers uh, don't know about equity crowdfunding and that it's even legal, and they're not going to understand the intricacies related to that. So often when companies work with us, essentially I get on a three-way call with the founders, the lawyers, and myself, and we essentially talk about, okay, this is what we're looking for. This is why we need it. We have the conversation with both the lawyers and the shareholders, and then the shareholders and the lawyers can have their own separate, private legal discussion about the implications of making those changes, so that the founders are able to make an informed decision about the changes that we recommend. Is the shareholders' decision for over 5% issuance a mandatory requirement for Equivesto, or is it recommended? So it's not mandatory. If you wanted, you could have share issuance at the full control of the board, but that is, of course, going to raise some eyebrows of your potential investors, because essentially, by having all of the power to issue shares at the board level, that means whoever's on your board can choose to issue new shares anytime they want, essentially, potentially an unlimited number. So if they so chose, it would be legal for the three of them to say, okay, we're going to issue 1 trillion shares to each of us right now for $1. And so suddenly the three board members would each have 1 trillion shares. There would be an additional 3 trillion shares in the float, and every other shareholder would instantly be diluted into nothing. So there's definitely risks from allowing things like that. And so that's why at least having a large requirement to issue shares. So if you're going to be issuing a large portion of the existing, total outstanding, that at least goes to the full shareholder vote, so that even though, participants from equity crowdfunding wouldn't have a vote anyways, because they might have non-voting shares, they're at least able to see what's going on and realize what you're doing, so they can call you and yell. But being fair, many of the participants who invest through equity crowdfunding, because the minimum is only $100, many of them won't be focused on the corporate governance decisions that you're making, because they're in it to support the company. And so our role as a platform is to make sure that their decision to do that is respected. And so, there's no potential for them to be really sort of taken advantage of when they're really coming in to provide that support. Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot here, but I'm going with, how would you do the due diligence on all the small investors, or would you be able to deny buyout those non-compliant micro shareholders?
Okay, so that's a great question. When you work with an equity crowdfunding platform, one of our requirements is to run a full background check, suitability check, and identity confirmation for all investors before they can even participate and even see your deal. So we are vetting all of the investors for you before they're even allowed to invest in your deal. So that's the first step. The second step is you need to basically countersign their purchase agreement and their joinder agreement. It's all done digitally, but essentially that gives you, the company, a chance to say no to anyone who's asking to invest through an equity crowdfunding round. So we check them out first to make sure that there's no criminals and everything's above board, but the final decision is always with you, the company, to decide whether or not you want this investor in your business.
Yeah, because this was specifically in the context of this longer situation, is what if someone from a competing company or their relative spouse would privately purchase, a small stake just to participate in shareholder meetings? Have you heard about, potential rogue micro investments to lure information?
So that's definitely something that people have been, that's something that comes to mind as a potential worry, which is why that's not something we've heard about happening from our perspective. But that is a reason why we would recommend moving a lot of the core decision making to the board level. So when things do come to a shareholder level, it is just very sort of higher level decisions that is something that you don't mind necessarily being shared with all your shareholders. But again, that's something that you as the company are able to keep track of, and you can choose to deny any potential shareholder if you so choose.
Yeah, and you mentions the non-compete clause here. How much would that cover you under circumstances like this? I can't see it covering you much.
Well, and here's the challenge with the non-compete, right? You can put any agreement you want in your shareholders agreement, but for you to actually go and enforce it, you're going to have to pay a lawyer to then go and approach the person and try to get them to do whatever it is that you want them to do. But the cost on your side to try to enforce something like that would be rather high. So even if you have that clause there and the person's in the wrong, actually making any change because of that might be quite difficult and might be sort of unenforceable, which is why potentially excluding the non-voting crowdfunding shares from that clause might make sense.
Great. Is there any questions here we missed that you're aware of?
I think that's all of the questions.
So I'm putting the link in the chat room right now for office hours. If people want to meet with you, just click on that link, and you can book a time this Friday. There are some other upcoming dates we'll be putting in there as well, so book that. And here it is. If people want to find out more about Equivesto and what you do, Alex, where can they go?
Yeah, so right on the screen to learn more, you can head to equivesto.com/learn. We also have a free shareholders agreement template with all these things in it using the exact samples that I showed today at equivesto.com/templates. You can also find us on Instagram and on Twitter at Equivesto and at Equivesto Inc. On Facebook, and you can email me at alexander.morsink@equivesto.com.
And we'll see everybody hopefully on Thursday with Dr. Sean Weiss, and we'll see everybody back here on Tuesday next week for talking about how much money you should raise when you're going out to raise capital. And again, Alex, one more time, what are we going to be talking about then?
So we're going to talk about the risks of raising too much or too little, exactly the importance of finding the right amount, and what sort of thinking you want to bring into the process to actually decide what the right amount is for that stage of your business.
All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for all the questions. Hopefully my technical issues didn't disrupt it too much. I appreciate it, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks.